Everyone laughed at her $100 bid until her German Shepherd froze, staring at something upstairs. The auction room smelled of dust and old paper when Evelyn Harrow raised her hand. No one else wanted the condemned Ashcombe Mansion. The roof sagged, the windows were boarded, and the town had already decided it was beyond saving. But as the gavel struck, her German Shepherd stiffened beside her, eyes locked on an upstairs window no one else noticed. And in that silent moment, the mansion no longer felt empty. Be honest. Would you have walked away from that house? Or followed your dog inside? Tell me what you'd do. The auction room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old paper, the kind of tired scent that clung to county buildings that had seen better decades. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and casting a pale wash over folding chairs, and a long plastic table where foreclosure files were stacked in uneven piles. Outside, Braddock Hollow stretched under a gray March sky. Brick factories with broken windows, rusted rail lines threading past abandoned warehouses, and storefronts that had long ago stopped pretending they might reopen. The steel town had once pulsed with furnace heat and paychecks that could raise a family. Now it carried a different rhythm, quieter, brittle, uncertain. Evelyn Harrow sat near the back of the room, straight-backed as always, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. At 68, she still carried the posture of someone who had spent decades standing at podiums, delivering graduation speeches, calming furious parents, and guiding a district of children through their first real disappointments. A former superintendent, retired, widowed 3 years ago. Those titles followed her like footnotes. Today, she carried only one label that mattered: bitter. At her feet lay Rex, her German Shepherd, broad-shouldered and steady, his amber eyes alert but calm. He had insisted on coming, refusing to remain in the truck when she opened the passenger door. Evelyn had hesitated, but the clerk at the front desk, a tired woman with silver-framed glasses, had only shrugged. Long as he's quiet. Rex was always quiet. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man with rolled-up sleeves and a voice trained to carry, moved briskly through smaller properties first: tax-delinquent duplexes, cracked ranch houses, empty lots overgrown with weeds. Investors in work boots murmured numbers back and forth without much emotion. It was business. And then the auctioneer cleared his throat and flipped to the final page. "Lot 47, he said. Ashcombe Mansion. Opening bid, $100. A ripple of laughter spread across the room, not loud but knowing. "Condemned structure," the auctioneer continued. "Structural instability, extensive vandalism, no active claims." Someone near the front leaned back in his chair. "You couldn't pay me $100 to take it." A few heads nodded. Contractors had inspected the Ashcombe place over the years. None had stayed long. Investors preferred manageable risks, not legends wrapped in rotting wood. The mansion had once belonged to the Ashcombe family, the steel magnates who had shaped Braddock Hollow's skyline, and some said, its darker corners. After the last heir died without children, the house had passed through legal limbo, and for decades it sat at the edge of town, behind bent iron gates, windows boarded and unboarded in cycles of decay and neglect, condemned, vandalized, whispered about. Evelyn had driven past it more times than she could count. Each time she had slowed without meaning to. "Opening at 100, the auctioneer repeated. "Do I hear 100? Silence answered him. Evelyn felt the quiet settle, thick and expectant. She could feel the eyes of strangers sliding over the file folder in her lap, the neat way she'd organized her notes, the pen aligned with the edge. Her daughter, Lydia, would call this reckless. Lydia had said so just last night. "Mom, it's a ruin. You don't need a project that big." Evelyn had smiled then, a small private smile. Maybe I do. She had spent 40 years holding other people's futures together. Budget cuts, teacher strikes, emergency closures when the mills shut down. When her husband died, the house they'd shared felt too quiet. When retirement came, the quiet deepened. The Ashcombe Mansion was not quiet. It was waiting. The auctioneer shifted impatiently. "No interest? We'll move on." Evelyn lifted her hand. The white bidding card flashed briefly under the fluorescent light. 100, she said, her voice steady. For a moment, no one reacted. Then chairs scraped. Several men turned fully to look at her. "Ma'am," the auctioneer said cautiously. "Just to confirm, lot 47? "Yes." A contractor 2 rows ahead leaned toward his neighbor. "Does she know what that place is?" Evelyn heard him. She did not respond. The auctioneer scanned the room again. $100. Do I have 150? Silence. He waited longer this time, as though giving the town itself a chance to object. No one did. Going once. Evelyn felt her pulse steady rather than spike. It wasn't excitement. It was something closer to resolve. Going twice. Beside her, Rex shifted. Sold. The gavel struck the table with a flat, echoing crack. In that same instant, Rex stiffened. It was subtle at first, a tightening along his spine, ears snapping forward, body angled slightly toward the far wall. His gaze did not rest on the auctioneer or the crowd. It fixed instead on a narrow window high along the municipal building's side, one that overlooked the street. Evelyn followed his line of sight automatically. Outside, not across the road, and beyond a patch of dormant grass, the distant outline of the Ashcombe Mansion rose above the tree line. Its roofline cut against the gray sky, skeletal and slanted. One upstairs window, third from the left, stood without boarding. Evelyn had driven by it enough to know that. But now, as she stared, she had the strangest impression of movement inside that dark square. Not a figure, not anything she could name, just a slight shift in shadow, as if something had passed between the interior and the glass. Rex let out a low breath. Not a growl, not quite. The auction room noise returned around her. Papers shuffled. Someone coughed. The clerk began sliding forms across the table. "Congratulations," the auctioneer said, though he did not sound certain. Evelyn lowered her hand slowly. Rex remained rigid, her eyes locked on that distant window. "Easy," she murmured, resting her palm against the thick fur behind his ear. He did not look away. Evelyn's gaze lingered on the mansion's upper floor for a few seconds more. The window stood empty again, just dark glass and faded trim. Probably a trick of the light. Probably. She signed her name in deliberate strokes on the purchase document. $100. A condemned mansion. A house no one wanted. As she stood, the folder tucked securely under her arm, she felt not foolishness, but something sharper, cleaner. Curiosity. And just beneath it, a quiet, stubborn defiance. Outside, the wind stirred through the empty streets of Braddock Hollow. Across town, the Ashcombe Mansion waited. Evelyn did not drive home after the auction. Instead, she steered her aging Subaru straight toward the iron gates she had passed for years without stopping. The tires hummed over cracked pavement, then slowed as the town thinned into the industrial edge. Boarded diners, a pawnshop with sun-bleached signage, and the skeleton of an old rail bridge rusting above the river. Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, unusually alert. His gaze stayed forward, ears angled toward the horizon. The mansion came into view gradually, rising behind a tangle of overgrown hedges and skeletal oak trees. Even from the road, it felt larger than memory allowed. 3 stories of dark brick and peeling trim, its once grand veranda sagging slightly along one corner. Several windows were boarded. Others gaped open like blind eyes. The gate hung crookedly on one hinge. Evelyn parked along the gravel drive and turned off the engine. The sudden silence pressed in around them. "Well," she said softly, adjusting her gloves, "we're home." The word felt strange but not unwelcome. Rex exited the car first, stepping carefully onto the gravel. He did not bound forward. He did not explore. Instead, he stood still, nose lifted slightly, drawing in the air with slow, deliberate breaths. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and old brick. Beneath it lingered something else. Aged wood, metal, a faint trace of cold stone. Evelyn approached the front steps. The wide oak door bore scars from past break-ins, but it still stood firm. A county seal marked the corner where it had once been condemned. She peeled the notice away without ceremony. Inside, the foyer opened into shadow. As dust hung in shafts of muted light filtering through cracked upper windows. The marble floor was veined and dull, scattered with fallen plaster. A chandelier dangled overhead, missing half its crystals, its frame coated in gray. The air felt cool, but not damp. Evelyn stepped inside first. Her shoes echoed softly across the stone. She waited, listening. Old houses always made noise, she reminded herself. Expansion, contraction, settling beams. After decades of neglect, this one would speak often. Rex crossed the threshold and stopped immediately at the base of the grand staircase. The staircase curved upward in a graceful arc, its banister carved with faded floral detail. The runner that once softened its steps had rotted away, leaving bare wood exposed. Above, the second-floor corridor stretched into dimness, with doors lining either side like closed eyes. Rex did not move. He did not bark. He simply stood, rigid, staring upward. Evelyn watched him for a moment. "What is it?" His tail remained still, not tucked, not wagging. His body language held alertness, not fear. "Just an old house," she said gently. She moved past him, walking slowly toward the living room on the right. Torn wallpaper peeled from the walls in long curls. A fireplace stood at the far end, blackened but intact. The windows here had been boarded from the inside, muting the light. The silence was not empty. It felt occupied, not by presence but by memory. Evelyn had spent her life in buildings that carried echoes, classrooms where generations of children had learned their first multiplication tables, auditoriums where diplomas were handed out to applause. And structures absorbed history. They held it. She walked back into the foyer. Rex had not shifted an inch. His eyes tracked the corridor above. A faint draft brushed against Evelyn's cheek, cool and sudden. She looked up instinctively. One of the upstairs doors stood slightly ajar. "Probably broken hinges," she murmured. But something about the angle of that door unsettled her. It did not sway with the wind. It simply rested open, revealing only darkness beyond. Rex let out a low, steady rumble. Not loud, not aggressive. A warning without urgency. Evelyn climbed the first 3 steps of the staircase. The wood creaked beneath her weight. Dust stirred in small spirals. Rex remained below. "Come on," she said quietly. He did not obey. Instead, he sat, still facing the corridor. Evelyn paused midway up the stairs. But the view from this height allowed her to see further down the second-floor hallway. Sunlight from a rear window cut across the floorboards in a thin, pale line. Nothing moved. Nothing shifted. And yet she felt distinctly observed, not threatened, not endangered, simply noticed. A house adjusting to its new occupant. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. "I've walked into tougher buildings than this," she said aloud, half smiling at the absurdity of speaking to empty space. She continued upward. At the top of the stairs, the air felt colder. Not drastically, just enough to register. The corridor stretched longer than it appeared from below. Framed portraits lined the walls, their glass cracked or clouded. Most had been vandalized, faces scratched out, names obscured. Evelyn stepped carefully toward the slightly open door. As it led into a bedroom stripped nearly bare. A mattress frame remained in one corner. The wallpaper, once ornate, had faded into a pale, indistinct pattern. She stepped inside fully. The floor dipped slightly near the far wall. Structural instability, she thought clinically. Behind her, the hallway floor creaked again. She turned quickly. Nothing stood there. Only the empty corridor, doors closed and silent. Downstairs, Rex barked once, sharp and controlled. Evelyn moved back toward the staircase. When she reached the landing, she saw him still at the base, eyes fixed upward. He had not barked out of fear. He had barked to signal. "I'm fine," she called down softly, but Rex's posture remained unchanged. Evelyn descended slowly. As she reached the final step, she noticed something subtle. The draft she had felt earlier seemed stronger near the left side of the staircase, where the west wing hallway branched off beyond the dining room. A faint thread of cold air brushed along her ankle. The windows in that direction were boarded. Where would a draft come from? She glanced toward the hallway. It lay in deeper shadow than the rest of the house. Rex shifted slightly now, not toward the staircase, but toward that darker corridor. His gaze moved from upstairs to the west wing. Evelyn followed his line of sight. The house did not feel hostile. It felt alert. She placed a hand on Rex's back. His muscles were tight beneath her palm. "We'll take this one room at a time," she said quietly. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling loose boards against brick, and a distant train horn echoed from somewhere beyond the river. A lonely industrial sound carried across town. Evelyn stood in the center of the foyer, surrounded by peeling walls and broken chandeliers, and felt something unexpected settle inside her. Not fear, not regret. A strange grounding, as if the mansion, in all its decay, had acknowledged her arrival. Rex exhaled slowly, but did not relax. His eyes returned once more to the second-floor corridor. And this time, even though she could not explain why, Evelyn did not dismiss it as imagination. The Ashcombe Mansion had been empty for decades, but tonight, it did not feel entirely alone. Morning in the Ashcombe Mansion arrived without warmth. A thin gray light filtered through the boarded windows, illuminating drifting dust and fractured molding. Evelyn stood at the long dining room table, one of the few pieces of furniture solid enough to trust, and unfolded a yellow legal pad. She had always approached overwhelming problems the same way. List them, categorize them, solve them. Structural inspection, utilities, roof reinforcement, security. Practical steps grounded her. Rex lay near the doorway at first, but within minutes he rose, nose low, tail level. He moved slowly toward the west wing hallway, the darker corridor branching off beyond the dining room. The air there seemed dimmer even in daylight. "Not yet," Evelyn called gently. He did not disobey. He paused, but he did not retreat. The west wing carried a different silence than the rest of the house. The foyer and staircase creaked with ordinary age. This hallway felt sealed, as though air rarely traveled through it, as Evelyn followed. The wallpaper here had blistered and peeled away in wide strips, revealing cracked plaster beneath. One section of the ceiling sagged slightly. Sunlight from the front windows barely reached this far. The corridor remained suspended in a muted twilight. Rex stopped midway down the hallway and pressed his nose toward the wall behind a toppled bookcase. The bookcase itself had collapsed years ago. Its shelves snapped and its contents long removed. What remained was a hollow rectangle of dust against the plaster, an outline marking where furniture once stood. Rex pawed once at the wall. Not aggressively, not frantically. Deliberately. Evelyn crossed her arms. "There's nothing there." Rex ignored her. He pawed again, scraping loose a flake of brittle paint. The sound echoed sharply down the corridor. Evelyn crouched beside him. The plaster felt cold under her fingertips. She tapped it lightly. Hollow. She stilled. Old mansions often had hidden ductwork or forgotten chimneys. Servant corridors. Storage cavities. It could be nothing. But Rex's focus unsettled her, not because he seemed frightened, but because he seemed certain. "Probably structural shifting," she said aloud, more for herself than for him. She stood and continued down the hallway, checking door frames and floorboards. The last room in the west wing had partially collapsed. A section of the ceiling lay caved in, exposing beams above. Wind slipped through gaps in the outer wall, carrying a thin draft through the corridor. "There," she told herself. "That explains it." But when she returned toward the fallen bookcase, she felt something different. A colder thread of air brushed against her wrist. It did not flow from the damaged ceiling at the far end. It seeped from the wall itself. Rex pressed his nose harder against the plaster and let out a low, concentrated whine. Evelyn leaned closer. The surface bore faint hairline cracks, not unusual in a structure this old, but one vertical seam seemed straighter than the others. Too straight. Running from baseboard upward, about 4 feet, before disappearing behind peeling wallpaper. She ran her hand along it. The plaster dipped slightly along that line. "Interesting," she murmured. Before she could examine it further, a sudden metallic thud echoed faintly from within the wall. Evelyn froze. The sound was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was contained, distant, and as though something small had shifted against something solid, metal against wood. Rex's ears snapped upright. He did not bark. He stepped back half a pace, then returned to the wall, nose working faster now. Evelyn's heartbeat quickened. Wind does strange things inside hollow spaces, she told herself. It can rattle loose pipes, knock debris. But this hallway did not connect to exterior plumbing. She had reviewed the county inspection summary. The west wing had been closed off long before the condemnation. The air temperature seemed to drop another degree. Not freezing, just noticeable. She placed her palm flat against the wall. Cold. Colder than the rest of the corridor. Rex scratched at the plaster again, this time with more insistence. A small chip broke free and fell to the floor. Easy, she said softly, but on placing her hand on his collar. He stopped immediately, but remained rigid. The silence thickened around them. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Evelyn turned her head slowly toward the ceiling. Nothing moved. The house made noise. It always would. She refused to let imagination outrun reason. But Rex's posture did not resemble anxiety. It resembled focus. He was not reacting to shadows or echoes. He was responding to something specific. Evelyn stepped back and studied the wall from a distance. The vertical seam caught her attention again. It was too precise to be random cracking. Her mind shifted into superintendent mode, assessing risk, analyzing structure. If there were a hollow space behind that wall, it could compromise stability. It would need inspection regardless. Tomorrow, she said quietly, but Rex tilted his head slightly. We'll get proper tools. We're not tearing into load-bearing plaster on a guess. Rex exhaled but did not relax fully. Evelyn walked back toward the dining room, though her gaze kept drifting over her shoulder. The hallway seemed darker now, not ominous, but heavy. The mansion no longer felt simply abandoned. It felt layered. Later that afternoon, as she sorted through the legal paperwork in the foyer, another faint metallic tap echoed from somewhere within the walls. Softer this time, almost swallowed by distance. Rex's head lifted instantly. He did not run. He did not bark. He simply stood and faced the west wing again. Evelyn followed his line of sight. The vertical seam behind the fallen bookcase sat in shadow. Not supernatural, not impossible, just unexplained. She closed the folder slowly and rose from her chair. You sense something I don't, she said to him. Rex walked back toward the hallway without hesitation. This time, Evelyn did not dismiss it. She stood beside him once more, staring at the plaster that concealed whatever lay beyond. The mansion had been condemned, vandalized, forgotten. But forgotten things sometimes remained intact behind walls. And if something physical existed inside that hollow space, something preserved, it would explain Rex's unwavering certainty. He was not reacting to ghosts. He was tracking evidence. A final soft metallic thud pulsed faintly from within. Evelyn felt tension coil in her chest. Not fear, but anticipation. The house was unstable, but it was not empty, and Rex knew exactly where to look. The following morning arrived sharper, colder, and Evelyn had barely slept. Not from fear, but from a restless curiosity that refused to quiet. The image of that straight vertical seam replayed in her mind over and over, too deliberate to be coincidence. She dressed in practical layers, tied her silver hair back, and retrieved the small toolbox she'd brought from her old home. Hammer, pry bar, utility knife, flashlight. Rex stood beside the West Wing hallway before she even finished her coffee. Impatient, she murmured. He didn't wag his tail. He simply waited. The house felt stiller than usual, as if holding its breath. Evelyn walked slowly down the dim corridor, boots crunching softly over fallen plaster. The toppled bookcase remained where it had fallen years ago, its skeletal frame leaning against the wall. The seam ran behind it, partially hidden. She set down the toolbox and began clearing the debris. The bookcase was lighter than it looked, rotted, hollowed by time. With effort, she dragged it aside, exposing the full stretch of plaster beneath. The seam was clearer now, a precise vertical line about 4 feet tall, and beneath it, near the baseboard, a slight horizontal fracture, almost forming a rectangle. Rex stepped closer, nose hovering inches from the wall. Evelyn ran her fingers across the surface again. The plaster felt thinner here, less solid. "Let's find out," she said quietly. She scored the seam gently with the utility knife, peeling away strips of brittle wallpaper. Underneath, the plaster shifted slightly beneath her pressure. She tapped it with the hammer. Hollow. Her pulse quickened. Carefully, now she wedged the pry bar into the horizontal fracture and applied steady pressure. The plaster cracked, not explosively, but with a contained snap. A small section broke free, revealing darkness beyond. Cold air rushed out against her wrist. Rex immediately lowered his head and inhaled deeply. Evelyn widened the opening, removing chunks of plaster piece by piece. Dust filled the corridor, swirling in pale shafts of light. Behind the wall was not insulation or studs. It was space. A narrow corridor, barely 3 feet wide, running parallel to the west wing hallway. She froze, staring into the dim interior. The air inside felt different, dry, preserved. "Servant passage," she whispered. Many mansions of that era had hidden corridors, built so staff could move unseen, but this one had been sealed completely. No record of it appeared in the county's condensed architectural notes. Rex stepped forward cautiously, peering into the opening but not entering. Evelyn retrieved her flashlight and aimed it inside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating intact wood paneling and narrow floorboards coated in fine dust. Cobwebs clung to the corners, undisturbed. This space had not been vandalized. It had not been touched. She widened the opening enough to step through. The passage extended about 20 feet, ending at a heavy oak door. The wood of the corridor remained remarkably preserved, protected from moisture and decay by the outer walls. The scent was faint but distinct. Old paper, aged varnish, something faintly metallic. Evelyn stepped carefully inside. Her boots echoed softly against the floorboards. Behind her, Rex entered without hesitation this time. The temperature within the corridor remained cooler than the main hallway, but steady, not drafty. Whatever air currents had flowed here were subtle and contained. She moved toward the oak door. It stood solid, untouched by vandalism. A brass plate had once been affixed to its center. Only faint screw marks remained. But carved directly into the wood, barely visible beneath dust, were 2 words: Private Study. Evelyn's throat tightened. The Ashcombe Mansion had been stripped and ransacked over decades. Anything valuable had vanished long ago. Yet this door had remained hidden, deliberately. She tried the handle. Locked. Not rusted, not broken. Locked from the outside. Rex stood at her side, alert but calm. "Someone sealed this," she murmured. She crouched, inspecting the frame. No recent damage, no signs of forced entry. She returned to the corridor entrance, fetched the pry bar, and worked it carefully between the door and its frame. The wood groaned under pressure. She paused, listening. Silence. She applied steady force again. With a sharp crack, the latch gave way. The door opened inward slowly, releasing a breath of stale but surprisingly clean air. Evelyn shone the flashlight inside. The beam revealed shelves, floor-to-ceiling shelves, books, ledgers, stacked boxes. Furniture stood intact. A desk, 2 chairs, a small filing cabinet. Dust lay evenly across every surface, undisturbed for decades. No vandal had entered this room. Rex stepped forward and scanned the space, then sat calmly beside her. The atmosphere inside felt different from the rest of the mansion. Contained, preserved, purposeful. Evelyn crossed the threshold. Her flashlight swept across the desk, revealing neatly arranged journals tied with faded ribbon. Beside them sat leather-bound financial ledgers, each labeled with careful script. The dates on the spine caught her breath. She reached for one journal, hands steady despite the weight building in her chest. The pages were intact, ink only slightly faded. The handwriting was elegant, precise, deliberate. She flipped to the first entry. January 12th, 1921. Clara Ashcombe. Evelyn exhaled slowly. The steel magnate's daughter. Rex shifted slightly beside her. then relaxed, his earlier tension gone. This was what he had been tracking. Not shadows, not superstition. The preserved scent of paper and ink carried faintly through hidden air currents, escaping through microscopic cracks in plaster. While his senses had followed it relentlessly, Evelyn moved deeper into the room. Architectural plans lay rolled in a corner, original blueprints of the mansion, including the hidden servant corridor she now stood within. But there was no mention of sealing it. That decision had come later. Intentional. She turned back toward the doorway. From the main hallway beyond the broken plaster, pale daylight filtered in. The rest of the mansion still bore scars of abandonment. But this room remained untouched, protected, hidden. Evelyn stood in the center of the study, heart pounding. Not from fear, but from revelation. The Ashcombe Mansion had not simply fallen into ruin. Parts of it had been deliberately concealed. Someone had wanted this room preserved. Someone had wanted it forgotten. Rex lay down at her feet, finally at ease. Because the house no longer felt watchful. It felt unveiled. And for the first time since stepping inside, Evelyn understood. The mansion had not been waiting for restoration. It had been waiting to be opened. Evelyn stood in the center of the hidden study, the flashlight beam resting now on the wide oak desk. The air inside the room felt still but not suffocating. Whatever had been sealed here had been protected from weather, from vandals, from time itself. Rex lay at her feet, head lowered but eyes open, calm in a way he had not been since stepping into the mansion. Evelyn approached the desk slowly, almost reverently. She brushed a thin layer of dust from the surface with her gloved hand. Beneath it, the wood gleamed faintly, preserved by decades of darkness. The journals were stacked in careful order, though bound in leather that had cracked but not crumbled. She untied the faded ribbon and opened the top volume. January 12th, 1921. The handwriting was elegant, firm. Clara Ashcombe. Evelyn swallowed. The Ashcombe name had once carried power across Braddock Hollow. The steel mills bore it. The hospital wing downtown had carried it too, before funding dried up and the plaque was quietly removed. She turned the page. The entries were not idle musings. They were precise, observational, detailed accounts of meetings, negotiations, arguments overheard between her father and company executives. January 28th, 1921. Father refuses to acknowledge the conditions at Furnace 6. The men are injured weekly. Compensation denied. Evelyn's brow furrowed. She flipped further. February 3rd, 1921. Mr. Halverson brought documents to Father tonight. Land parcels acquired under pressure. Families paid half their value. Some threatened. Her fingers tightened slightly on the page. This was not social commentary. These were records. Rex shifted, then rose briefly to circle once before lying back down near the doorway, positioned as if guarding the entrance. Evelyn glanced around the room again. The shelves were lined with financial ledgers, heavy books labeled with years and coded notations. She pulled one free. The columns were neat, almost sterile. Payment distributions, equipment costs, legal fees, and then entries that stood out. Consultation, municipal oversight, special allocation, city discretion. Large sums, recurring. She felt a chill unrelated to temperature. She moved to the filing cabinet and opened the top drawer. Inside were carefully folded letters, and each sealed but unaddressed. The ink had faded slightly but remained legible. One envelope bore Clara's name in bold script. Evelyn hesitated before opening it. Inside was a draft letter. To the Board of Labor Inquiry, I write to formally report documented evidence of wage suppression and coercive land acquisition within the Ashcombe steel operations. I fear retaliation, but can no longer remain silent. The letter ended abruptly, the final line trailing off mid-sentence. No record in town archives had ever mentioned Clara Ashcombe challenging her family's empire. The narrative passed down over generations described her as delicate, withdrawn, prone to nervous instability. Evelyn had heard the whispers herself growing up. The daughter who couldn't handle the pressure. The fragile girl who faded away. No, this did not read like fragility. It read like defiance. She turned back to the journals, scanning for later dates. March 14th, 1921. They have begun to question my loyalty. Father no longer allows me access to the office files. He believes I am naive. He underestimates the men who suffer. March 28th, 1921. I will preserve copies. If something happens to me, the truth must survive. Evelyn's heartbeat quickened. She searched for the final entry. The handwriting near the end had grown sharper, more compressed. April 6th, 1921. They have called me unstable. Father says it is for my own good. I know what that means. The entries stopped. No final page. No resolution. She closed the journal slowly. The room seemed smaller now, not physically, but morally. This was not merely an abandoned mansion with old furniture. This was a sealed archive. Rex rose again and walked toward a lower shelf beneath the window. He sniffed at a small wooden box tucked between two ledgers. Evelyn crouched and retrieved it. Inside were rolled architectural plans, the original blueprints of the mansion, including the servant corridors and this hidden study. But in the margins, drawn in Clara's handwriting, were additional notes. Seal West Passage. Preserve documents. Do not trust internal staff. Evelyn exhaled. Clara herself had sealed this corridor, not to hide shame, to protect evidence. The metallic thuds Evelyn had heard days earlier were no mystery now. Changes in temperature had shifted old pipes or loose brackets within the sealed walls. Nothing supernatural, nothing unseen, just a preserved room responding to exposure. Rex lay down again, and finally resting his head on his paws. The tension that had coiled through him since the auction was gone. He had not been reacting to a presence. He had been following a scent, aged paper, trapped air currents escaping through hairline cracks. He had led her here. Evelyn returned to the desk and sat carefully in the wooden chair. The weight of what she held pressed inward. If these records were authentic, and there was no reason to believe otherwise, then the official story of Clara Ashcombe was incomplete at best. Manufactured at worst. The financial ledgers documented questionable transfers. The journals documented intent. The letter documented accusation. She glanced around the room once more. Everything was orderly, deliberate. Clara had not been erased by accident. She had been neutralized. The realization did not frighten Evelyn. It unsettled her in a different way. For decades, the Ashcombe Mansion had been dismissed as cursed, unstable, dangerous. Stories filled the void left by absence, but the truth felt far more grounded and far more troubling. Someone had wanted these records buried, and someone had succeeded. Until now. Evelyn gathered the top 3 journals and set them carefully on the desk. She did not remove anything yet. This room needed to remain intact. She stood and walked toward the doorway. From this angle, the contrast was stark. The preserved study behind her and the decayed west wing beyond. The house had been ransacked everywhere except here. The protection was intentional. Rex rose and followed her to the threshold. She turned off the flashlight, letting natural light from the corridor spill faintly into the study. The silence inside the room felt different now, not tense, resolved. She stepped back into the west wing hallway and looked at the jagged opening in the plaster. This would need reinforcement, documentation, possibly legal consultation. She had intended to restore a structure. Instead, she had uncovered a record. Rex nudged her hand gently. "I see it too," she murmured. The mansion was no longer a curiosity purchased for defiance. It was evidence, and evidence changed everything. The next morning, Evelyn locked the hidden study carefully before leaving the mansion. She reinforced the broken plaster with temporary plywood, not to conceal it again, but to protect it from exposure. Rex watched every movement, calm but attentive. While the sky over Braddock Hollow hung low and pale as she drove toward the town archives, an aging brick building wedged between a shuttered pharmacy and a barber shop that had not changed its striped pole in 40 years. Inside, the air smelled of paper and dust, layered with decades of stored memory. The woman at the front desk recognized Evelyn instantly. "Mrs. Harrow, I heard you bought the Ashcombe place." Evelyn smiled faintly. "It seems word travels faster than paperwork." The woman's expression tightened. "People don't usually go near that house." "I've always preferred to read the original record," Evelyn replied gently. The archives were dimly lit, shelves packed with bound newspapers, microfilm reels, and town ledgers dating back to the late 1800s. Evelyn requested records related to the Ashcombe family between 1920 and 1925. The clerk hesitated before retrieving several volumes. "Most of what you'll find is public philanthropy," she said. "Hospitals, school donations." Evelyn nodded and carried the stacks to a wooden table near the back. Rex lay quietly beneath it. She began with local newspapers from 1921. The headlines painted a predictable portrait. "Ashcombe Steel expands operations. City prospers under industrial growth. Family daughter seeks treatment for nervous condition." Evelyn stilled. She leaned closer to the last article. "April 14th, 1921. Miss Clara Ashcombe, daughter of steel magnate Theodore Ashcombe, has been admitted to a private care facility following what family representatives describe as emotional instability brought on by personal strain." Well, the wording was careful, controlled. No mention of labor disputes. No mention of whistleblowing. She flipped to later editions. June 1921. Family confirms Miss Ashcombe has relocated for extended convalescence. Privacy requested. That was it. No obituary, no follow-up. Just disappearance under a polite veil. Evelyn turned to municipal records. Property transfers, zoning adjustments, council votes. Several entries caught her eye. March 3rd, 1921. Emergency closed session meeting. April 2nd, 1921. Budget allocation. Special discretionary fund. The sums listed matched entries she had seen in Clara's ledgers. She felt a slow burn rising in her chest. Not shock this time, but clarity. The narrative had been rewritten. Clara had not simply faded away. She had been discredited, declared unstable, removed from public discourse. Evelyn requested access to medical records from that period. The clerk frowned apologetically. "Anything psychiatric from that era is sealed. Even now, it's difficult to obtain." "Was there ever confirmation of her death?" Evelyn asked quietly. The clerk flipped through an index. "No record in county death logs." Evelyn sat back slowly. No death certificate. No relocation address. Only a declaration of instability, followed by silence. Rex shifted beneath the table, sensing the tension in her posture. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. For decades, Clara Ashcombe had existed only as a cautionary tale, proof that power could fracture even the strongest family. But the journals painted a different picture. Clara had been methodical, documented, precise. The word unstable had been assigned, not earned. And Evelyn gathered the files and returned them to the desk. As she prepared to leave, she noticed an elderly man seated near the microfilm machine. His thin white hair caught the light. His posture was stooped but alert. "Looking into the Ashcombes?" he asked quietly. His voice carried a tremor, but not uncertainty. Evelyn studied him for a moment. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "My grandfather worked Furnace 6. Evelyn's pulse quickened. "He used to say the daughter wasn't like the rest of them," the man continued. "Said she came down to the floor once, asked questions no one else dared." "Did he ever mention what happened to her?" Evelyn asked. The man's jaw tightened. "Said after she tried to speak up, the doctors came. That's what they called them, doctors. But no one saw her leave." Silence stretched between them. My grandfather always said the town agreed not to ask," the man added quietly. "Too many paychecks depended on staying quiet." Evelyn felt the weight of that sentence settle deeply. Systemic silence. She thanked him softly and walked out into the pale afternoon light. The wind moved along Main Street, carrying the faint scent of rust and river water. As she drove back toward the mansion, her thoughts aligned sharply. This was no isolated injustice. The financial entries, the closed council meetings, the psychiatric declaration, all aligned within weeks of Clara's journal ending. She pulled into the gravel drive and shut off the engine. The Ashcombe Mansion stood silent, its windows reflecting the gray sky. It no longer felt mysterious. It felt deliberate. Inside, she walked directly to the hidden study. Rex followed closely, and his movements steady now, no longer searching, but accompanying. She reopened the journal to the final entry. April 6th, 1921. They have called me unstable. Father says it is for my own good. The words felt heavier after the archives. Evelyn imagined Clara seated at this very desk, pen pressed firmly into paper, knowing the risk. The town had accepted the official version. They had accepted her erasure. Evelyn placed the journal gently back onto the desk. The anger she felt was not loud or explosive. It was measured, moral. Clara had attempted to expose corruption within her father's steel empire. She had been neutralized through reputation, and the town had cooperated. Rex rested at her feet again, calm and steady. The house no longer felt tense or watchful. It felt like a vault opened too late. Young Evelyn walked to the corridor and looked back at the preserved study. This was not about restoration anymore. This was about record. Clara Ashcombe had been labeled unstable to protect powerful men, and the proof had been hidden behind a wall. Evelyn closed the study door gently. The Ashcombe Mansion had once symbolized prosperity. Now it symbolized silence, and silence, she realized, could last a century if no one questioned it. But someone finally had. The shift began quietly. Evelyn contacted Marcus Bell 2 days later. Marcus had grown up in Braddock Hollow and returned after journalism school in Pittsburgh, determined to cover the stories national outlets overlooked. His small office sat above a hardware store on Main Street, walls plastered with pinned clippings and maps marked in red ink. When Evelyn placed Clara's journal on his desk, he didn't speak for a long moment. "You understand what this is," he finally said. "I believe I do," Evelyn replied. Marcus turned the pages slowly, careful not to crease the fragile paper. The ledger entries she had photographed rested beside it. Municipal records, budget allocations. "This would explain why Furnace 6 shut down without investigation," he murmured, "and why several council members resigned within a year." He looked up at her. "You're certain these were sealed behind a wall?" "Yes. And no one else has accessed them. Not in decades." Marcus leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed in thought. "If this is authentic, it rewrites half the town's history." "That's the point," Evelyn said evenly. He nodded slowly. "I'll start verifying names, matching payments, cross-referencing city records. But once this surfaces, it won't stay quiet." Evelyn understood. She left the office with Rex at her side, the afternoon sky heavy with approaching rain. The first phone call came that evening. Unknown number. She let it ring twice before answering. Silence. Then a click. No words. She hung up. Rex, lying near the foyer, lifted his head immediately. His ears angled toward the front door. "It's nothing," she said softly. The second call came the next morning. This time a voice spoke. "You're digging in places better left alone." The tone wasn't shouted. It wasn't threatening in volume. It was controlled. Evelyn did not respond. The line went dead. Rex stood and moved toward the front window, posture alert. Evelyn walked to the door and checked the lock. Secure. She reminded herself that small towns carried long memories and longer loyalties. The article Marcus published 3 days later did not accuse anyone directly. It presented documented facts. Historic ledgers, closed council meetings, Clara's journal excerpts. It asked a single question. What truly happened to Clara Ashcombe in 1921? The reaction was immediate. Some residents expressed support, especially families who remembered mill layoffs and unexplained land seizures. Others accused Evelyn of stirring resentment in a town already struggling to survive. At the grocery store, conversations hushed when she entered. At the gas station, 2 men stopped mid-sentence as she passed. That evening, rain lashed against the mansion's windows. The wind rattled loose boards along the veranda. Evelyn sat in the dining room reviewing additional pages Marcus had requested. Rex lay beside her, but his restlessness had returned. not the focused alertness from earlier chapters. This was different. He stood abruptly and moved toward the West Wing corridor. "Rex!" she called gently. He did not bark. He did not growl. He positioned himself between the foyer and the hallway leading toward the sealed study. His body stiffened. Evelyn rose slowly. The house was quiet except for rain striking the roof. Then, a subtle scrape from outside. Not wind, not settling beams. A deliberate footstep against gravel. Rex's low growl vibrated through the hallway. Evelyn turned off the dining room lamp, plunging the foyer into near darkness. She approached the front window cautiously and parted the curtains slightly. A shadow moved near the side of the house. Her pulse quickened, but she did not panic. Rex moved toward the side entrance door now, stance protective. Another scrape. Closer. The doorknob rattled once, firm, testing. Rex barked sharply this time, deep and commanding. The handle stilled. Footsteps retreated across gravel, fading into rain. Evelyn remained motionless for several seconds, listening. Silence returned. Rex stood rigid for nearly a minute before slowly lowering his posture, but he did not fully relax. Evelyn walked to the door and inspected it. No damage, but the message was unmistakable. Someone had approached, not out of curiosity, out of warning. The following morning, she discovered a broken window at the rear of the mansion, shattered from the outside. The glass lay scattered across the wet grass, while nothing inside had been taken, nothing disturbed. It was not theft. It was intimidation. Evelyn stood in the yard, rain-soaked grass brushing her ankles. Rex positioned himself beside her, scanning the perimeter. She felt fear now, but not paralyzing, focused. The article had unsettled someone. The ledgers and journals were no longer historical artifacts. They were leverage. She called Marcus. "You're not surprised," he said quietly, after she described the broken window. "No," she admitted. "I've received 2 anonymous emails telling me to drop it." They both understood what that meant. "Do we stop?" Marcus asked. Evelyn looked up at the mansion's second-story windows. The west wing remained shadowed behind boarded glass. "No," she said. Rex walked toward the sealed corridor and sat there again, not restless, but resolute. He had guarded the hidden truth. Now he guarded it openly. That evening, Evelyn installed motion lights along the exterior. She reinforced the side door with heavier bolts. Practical measures. Controlled responses. The mansion no longer felt like a mystery to solve. It felt like a battleground for record. As night settled, Rex resumed his post near the West Wing hallway. He no longer searched for hidden air currents. He monitored. Evelyn sat at the dining room table once more, reviewing Clara's journal under lamplight. Outside, the wind swept through Braddock Hollow, carrying with it the weight of exposed history. The silence that had protected Clara for a century had cracked, and someone was trying to seal it again. The rain passed overnight, leaving Braddock Hollow washed and brittle under a pale sky. The broken window at the rear of the mansion had been temporarily boarded, the raw wood stark against the aging brick. Evelyn stood in the West Wing corridor, staring at the jagged plaster opening that led to Clara's hidden study. She had reinforced the entrance properly now, hinged paneling that allowed access but prevented casual intrusion. Rex moved calmly at her side. He no longer growled at shadows. He no longer paced. The threat outside had sharpened the purpose inside. Evelyn stepped back into the preserved study, the scent of aged paper faint but steady. She sat at the desk and opened one of the financial ledgers she had not yet examined thoroughly. Marcus had suggested they cross-reference payment dates against municipal meeting records. She flipped to March 1921 again. A series of entries appeared under a column marked Consultation. Large sums transferred within days of Clara's final journal entry. She ran her finger down the names listed in abbreviated initials. One set of initials appeared repeatedly. CMB. Her mind worked quickly. Councilmember Bennett. A name that still carried weight in town. His grandson now owned the largest construction firm in Braddock Hollow. Evelyn turned to another page. Payments labeled Special Oversight. Then a final entry dated April 7th, 1921, one day after Clara's last recorded journal note. Medical certification, discretionary expense. The amount listed was significant. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She moved to the filing cabinet again and searched the lower drawers. At the very bottom, beneath a false wooden base that shifted slightly under pressure, she discovered another envelope, this one thicker, untied. She lifted the base carefully and slid the envelope free. Inside were additional documents, typed psychiatric assessments bearing Clara's name. The language was clinical, sterile, symptoms of hysteria, paranoia related to business matters. Recommendation: indefinite private confinement for emotional protection. The signatures at the bottom matched two names listed in the ledger under consultation. The ink differed slightly, less fluid, more mechanical. Fabricated. Evelyn exhaled slowly. Clara had not simply been declared unstable. Her instability had been purchased. The room felt heavier now, not with tension, but with clarity. Rex stood and approached the doorway of the study, sniffing along the baseboards. Yet he paused where the servant corridor met the sealed wall that had once hidden everything. The air currents that had preserved the scent were obvious now. Small ventilation gaps along the brickwork allowed minimal airflow, enough for Rex to detect the trapped smell of paper long before Evelyn understood its source. He had not sensed something unseen. He had followed something physical. Evidence preserved by architecture. Evelyn gathered the new documents carefully and photographed each page before returning them to the envelope. She would not remove them yet. The integrity of the room mattered. She stepped back into the corridor and leaned against the wall, allowing the full picture to assemble in her mind. Clara documented corruption. Clara attempted to report it. City officials received payments. A psychiatric declaration followed immediately. Clara disappeared. The pattern was not chaotic. It was systemic. Rex brushed against her leg lightly. "You were right," she murmured. Later that afternoon, Evelyn drove to Marcus's office again. He scanned the newly photographed psychiatric reports with increasing intensity. "This ties everything together," he said quietly. "It's not just labor exploitation. It's coordinated suppression." He leaned back in his chair. "They didn't just silence her. They built paperwork to justify it." Evelyn nodded. "Can you prove the signatures were purchased?" she asked. Marcus tapped the ledger printouts. "The payments are dated within 48 hours of the certification." He looked up at her. "That's not coincidence." Outside the office window. At Main Street carried a tension Evelyn hadn't noticed before. Conversations lingered longer. Eyes watched more closely. The article Marcus published next was firmer, detailing the ledger payments and the psychiatric certification timeline. He avoided naming modern descendants directly, but the historical connections were unmistakable. The reaction intensified. Some town residents brought old photographs and family stories to Marcus's office, grateful someone was finally asking questions. Others grew defensive. The grandson of Councilmember Bennett released a public statement dismissing the findings as misinterpretation of incomplete records. That night, as Evelyn returned to the mansion, she noticed a vehicle idling briefly at the end of the gravel drive before pulling away. Rex's posture stiffened but did not escalate. Inside, the house felt steadier. The west wing no longer seemed oppressive. It felt open, exposed. Evelyn walked to the ballroom, a cavernous room she had not yet fully explored. Sunlight streamed through tall, cracked windows, illuminating dust suspended like fine ash. She imagined the room filled decades ago. Formal gatherings, polished shoes, orchestrated civility. Now it stood hollow. The past was no longer a whisper behind walls. It was documented. Rex trotted through the open space, calm and watchful. Evelyn turned slowly in the center of the ballroom. The narrative had shifted. What began as curiosity had become confrontation. Clara had been discredited through forged authority. The town had accepted it because power dictated truth. But power shifted over time. Records did not. Evelyn walked back toward the West Wing corridor, pausing at the sealed study entrance. The hidden room no longer symbolized secrecy. It symbolized preservation. The injustice was larger than one family. It had been embedded in the town's foundation. And now that foundation was cracking. Rex lay down in the hallway outside the study, head resting on his paws, peaceful for the first time since the night of the broken window. His tension had not been fear. It had been purpose. He had led her to the hidden corridor. Now that it was open, he no longer needed to search. The truth was no longer concealed. It was unfolding. And it was not finished yet. The third article ran on a Sunday morning. Marcus chose his words carefully, but the headline carried weight. Archive documents suggest systemic cover-up in 1921 Ashcombe case. By noon, Braddock Hollow felt split along invisible lines. Outside the diner on Main Street, two men argued in low, heated voices. At the post office, Evelyn noticed people watching her openly now, not whispering, not hiding it. Some nodded in quiet support. Others looked away. Evelyn walked Rex through town that afternoon with steady composure. She would not retreat. Not now. "You've stirred a hornet's nest," the hardware store owner muttered, not unkindly, as she passed. "Truth does that," she replied calmly. Back at the mansion, reporters had begun calling Marcus for interviews. Regional outlets picked up the story. Social media amplified it beyond county lines. The Ashcombe Mansion was no longer just a decaying relic. Yes, it had become a symbol. Evelyn stood in the ballroom, studying the cracked plaster and peeling gold trim along the high ceiling. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long stripes across the warped wooden floor. "This is where it happens," she murmured. Rex trotted across the vast room, nails clicking faintly against the boards. If the town was going to debate Clara's legacy, they would do it here, in the house that had hidden her voice for a century. Evelyn called Marcus that evening. "I want to host a public forum," she said. "In the mansion?" he asked. "Yes." There was a pause on the line. "That's bold." "It's appropriate." Within days, flyers circulated. Marcus shared the invitation through his paper's channels. Some residents scoffed. Others expressed relief. The day before the scheduled gathering, a certified letter arrived at the mansion. Evelyn opened it at the dining room table while Rex lay beside her. The letterhead bore the name of Bennett and Sons Construction. It challenged her legal right to access certain historically sensitive materials found within the mansion. It suggested that ownership of archival documents could be disputed. Evelyn read it twice, then folded it neatly. Rex's head lifted, sensing her stillness. "They're feeling pressure," she said quietly. The next morning, two men arrived at the gate. Well-dressed, formal. They introduced themselves as legal representatives for interested descendants. They did not step beyond the gravel drive. "You understand," one said politely, "that reopening old wounds may harm the town's stability." Evelyn regarded them steadily. Stability built on suppression isn't stability." The men exchanged a glance. "You may face legal consequences," the other added. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Then I will face them." They left without further argument. Rex watched them go, posture firm but silent. The day of the forum arrived under a clear, bright sky. Evelyn spent the morning arranging folding chairs in the ballroom. Marcus set up a small table at the front with printed copies of Clara's journal excerpts and selected ledger entries. The cracked chandelier above them hung like a relic of forgotten opulence. People began arriving in cautious clusters. Former steelworkers' grandchildren, retired teachers, young families curious about the commotion. A few skeptics stood near the back, arms folded. Evelyn stood at the front of the room, the preserved journals resting carefully on the table beside her. Rex lay at her feet, calm and steady. The murmurs quieted as she began. She did not dramatize. She did not accuse. She presented dates, ledger entries, council meeting records, psychiatric certifications issued within 48 hours of documented financial transfers. Marcus followed with contextual history, how industrial power shaped municipal governance during that era. A man in his 70s stood slowly near the middle of the room. "My grandfather lost his land in 1921, he said. Said he was pressured to sell. We always thought he'd exaggerated." Another voice rose from the back. "My grandmother used to whisper about Clara. Said she tried to help." The room shifted. What had been rumor became testimony. Not explosive, not chaotic, measured. Evelyn watched faces soften, harden, reconsider. A younger man stood abruptly. Why dig this up now? It doesn't change what happened. Evelyn met his gaze. No, she said calmly, but it changes what we acknowledge. The air felt charged, not hostile, but alive. For decades, the Ashcombe Mansion had carried superstition. Now it carried documentation. Rex remained still throughout, head resting on his paws. His earlier tension had dissolved completely. The sealed corridor was open. The evidence was public. He had no reason to guard anymore. As the meeting ended, conversations lingered in small groups. Some thanked Evelyn quietly. Others left without speaking. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. Marcus approached her near the veranda. This won't be the end of it, he said. Oh, I know, she replied, but it's the beginning. Behind them, the mansion stood unchanged in structure, cracked, aging, imperfect. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The truth was no longer confined to a hidden study. It had entered the town square. And once spoken aloud, it could not be resealed. In the weeks following the forum, Braddock Hollow changed in small but visible ways. The conversations no longer stopped entirely when Evelyn entered a room. They shifted, yes, but they did not vanish. Some people approached her directly now, carrying yellowed photographs or brittle letters discovered in attics. Marcus's reporting expanded. Regional historians contacted him. A university research department requested access to copies of the ledgers. The pressure that had once been covert now became official. The county council announced a public review of municipal records from 1920 to 1922. For the first time in a century, Clara Ashcombe's name appeared in formal proceedings, not as an unstable daughter, but as a historical subject of inquiry. The mansion's ballroom hosted a second gathering, this one larger, more deliberate. Evelyn stood at the front again, but this time she was not alone. Marcus introduced several speakers, a retired labor historian, a descendant of mill workers displaced in the early 1920s, and an archivist who had verified the authenticity of the documents. The room was fuller now, not packed, but attentive. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching suspended dust in golden columns. The cracked chandelier overhead swayed slightly in a draft, but no one looked up in fear. The house no longer carried whispers of haunting. It carried testimony. Evelyn watched as a gray-haired woman stepped forward to speak. My grandmother worked in the Ashcombe textile annex, the woman said. She told us stories of Clara coming to the workers quietly, asking about injuries, asking about wages. The woman's voice trembled but did not falter. We thought those were just family legends. Another man described his great-grandfather's land dispute, forced sale under pressure from city officials. Marcus presented enlarged copies of the ledger entries, the psychiatric certification timeline, the municipal budget allocations that aligned too precisely to dismiss. The pattern became undeniable. What had once been dismissed as rumor now held documentary spine. At the back of the room, two men from Bennett and Sons Construction stood with folded arms. They did not interrupt. They did not challenge. But they did not leave either. Rex lay calmly near the front, no longer stationed at hallways or doors. His body language was relaxed, almost indifferent to the growing crowd. His work, the discovery, was complete. Evelyn took the podium last. She did not accuse modern descendants. She did not assign blame beyond what the documents supported. This house, she said, her voice steady and clear, was built as a symbol of industrial success. But within its walls, someone tried to record a different truth. She gestured toward the table holding Clara's preserved journals. For decades, that truth was dismissed as instability. Silence filled the ballroom. We cannot change what happened in 1921, she continued, but we can choose how we remember it. There was no applause at first, only stillness. Then a few nods, a quiet murmur of agreement. Not explosive, not dramatic, grounded. After the gathering dispersed, Marcus approached Evelyn near the veranda. The County Historical Commission wants to review the mansion, he said. They're considering landmark status. Evelyn looked out across the overgrown lawn. On what grounds? Labor history, civic transparency, architectural preservation. She exhaled slowly. The mansion had once symbolized power concentrated in one family's hands. Now it was becoming something else. A record, a warning, a testament. Weeks later, a formal statement from the county acknowledged that archival documents suggested misconduct within early 20th century municipal governance. Well, the language was careful, but it was official. A plaque was commissioned, not to glorify the Ashcombe family, but to mark the site as a historical location tied to labor reform and civic accountability. On the day the historical designation was announced, Evelyn stood once more in the ballroom. Workers installed temporary lighting. The cracked plaster had been stabilized, but not fully restored. She wanted the age visible. The mansion's scars remained. They mattered. Lydia arrived quietly that afternoon. Evelyn's daughter had avoided the earlier gatherings, uneasy about the attention. But now she stepped through the front doors, pausing in the foyer. "I didn't think this would go this far," Lydia admitted. "Neither did I," Evelyn replied. They walked together through the West Wing corridor. As Lydia stared at the hinged panel Evelyn had installed to protect the study. "This is where you found it?" she asked softly. "Yes." They entered the preserved room. The journals rested neatly on the desk. The air felt steady, almost reverent. Lydia ran her fingers lightly over the desk's surface. "You were right to buy it," she said quietly. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Rex padded in behind them and lay down at the doorway, peaceful. The house no longer felt defensive. It felt integrated into the town's story rather than apart from it. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, a small crowd gathered on the lawn for the unveiling of the historical marker. The plaque was simple. Ashcombe Mansion, site of preserved records revealing early 20th century labor and civic injustice. Historical landmark. Braddock Hollow County. No accusations. No dramatics. Just acknowledgement. Evelyn stood beside Rex as the cloth was lifted. The applause was soft, respectful, not triumphant, earned. The mansion behind them stood as it always had, brick weathered, windows cracked, structure imperfect. But its meaning had shifted. The sealed corridor was open. The story was public, and the town had chosen to face it. Rex rose and walked calmly through the once shadowed West Wing, no longer pausing at the plaster seam. There was nothing left to guard. The truth stood in daylight now, and daylight, once welcomed, no longer felt threatening. Autumn arrived gently in Braddock Hollow. The steel-gray skies of early spring had given way to clear blue mornings and air that smelled faintly of leaves turning dry at their edges. The Ashcombe Mansion stood at the top of the gravel drive, its brickwork still weathered, its trim still chipped, but no longer abandoned. Volunteers came on weekends. Retired carpenters repaired floorboards in the West Wing. High school students helped clear brush from the lawn. A local electrician donated time to stabilize wiring in the main hall. No one tried to modernize the house completely. That had never been Evelyn's intention. They preserved it, documented it, honored it. The ballroom, once hollow and echoing, now held rows of folding chairs neatly stacked along one wall, and framed copies of Clara's journal excerpts displayed under protective glass. The cracked chandelier had been reinforced, but left imperfect, its missing crystals deliberate reminders of age. Rex moved freely now through rooms that had once held tension, and his steps were unhurried. He no longer paused at the plaster seam in the West Wing corridor. He no longer stationed himself at doors. The house did not require guarding anymore. One Saturday afternoon, Evelyn stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching volunteers sweep the foyer below. Sunlight poured through cleaned upper windows, catching floating dust in warm gold. The staircase creaked under her weight as she descended, but the sound felt familiar rather than ominous. Marcus entered through the front door, carrying a rolled blueprint under his arm. "The commission approved the final landmark designation," he said, unable to hide a small smile. "It's official." Evelyn accepted the document and unrolled it carefully across the dining room table. The seal of Braddock Hollow County marked the bottom corner. Ashcombe Mansion. Registered historical landmark dedicated to labor history and civic accountability. It felt strange seeing the mansion described in formal language that did not glorify industry, nor romanticize decline. It described record, truth. Rex lay near the table, eyes half closed in the late afternoon warmth. "You've changed the town," Marcus said quietly. Evelyn shook her head. "The town changed itself. I just opened a door." Outside, Lydia's car pulled into the gravel drive. She had been visiting more often in recent weeks. At first cautiously, then with growing ease, she stepped inside carrying a small cardboard box. "I found these in Dad's old study," Lydia said, placing the box on the table. Letters he wrote about the mill's closing, about what it did to families. Evelyn looked at her daughter for a long moment. "May we add them?" Lydia asked softly. "To the exhibit," she clarified. Evelyn nodded. The mansion had begun as a symbol of one family's power. Now it was becoming a repository of many families' experiences. They walked together through the West Wing corridor. Lydia paused near the hinged panel leading to Clara's study. "I was afraid this house would swallow you," Lydia admitted quietly. Evelyn smiled faintly. "It nearly did." "But it didn't," Lydia said. They stepped inside the preserved study. The room felt unchanged from the day Evelyn first opened it, but the weight inside had shifted. It no longer felt hidden. It felt honored. The journals rested carefully in archival sleeves. The psychiatric certification copies were framed alongside ledger entries showing payment dates. A timeline stretched along one wall, connecting municipal records to Clara's final entry. Rex entered and lay down in his usual spot by the doorway. Lydia knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "You knew something was there, didn't you?" Rex thumped his tail once against the floor. Evelyn watched him, remembering the day of the auction, how he had stiffened, staring toward an upstairs window no one else noticed. That instinct had led her here. Not superstition. Scent, airflow, evidence. Even now, the faint draft from the servant corridor brushed lightly along the floorboards. It no longer felt cold. It felt open. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the Historical Commission installed a permanent placard inside the foyer, detailing the discovery of Clara's journals and the subsequent archival verification. Town residents gathered quietly. Oh, there were no protests now. No legal representatives at the gate. Just neighbors. Some reflective, some proud, some contemplative. Evelyn stood near the staircase, Lydia beside her. When the small ceremony ended, people lingered in soft conversation. A retired steelworker approached Evelyn, hat in hand. "My grandfather lost his farm in 1921, he said. "He always said someone tried to stand up for them. I guess he was right." Evelyn nodded. He was. Rex rose and walked calmly through the foyer, greeting a child who crouched to pet him. His demeanor was steady, protective only in presence, not in posture. The West Wing corridor, once dim and forbidding, now carried installed lighting and informational panels. Visitors walked through it without hesitation. The sealed corridor had become part of the guided tour, explained clearly, demystified. The mansion's structure had not changed dramatically. Its bricks were still chipped, its ceilings still cracked, but its meaning had shifted entirely. As twilight settled over Braddock Hollow, Evelyn stepped outside onto the veranda. The town below glowed with scattered porch lights and street lamps. The rail bridge in the distance caught the last line of sun. Lydia joined her. "You could have stayed retired quietly," her daughter said. "I was retired quietly," Evelyn replied. They shared a small laugh. Rex lay down at their feet, sighing deeply. The house behind them no longer felt watchful. It felt integrated, woven into the town's present, rather than suspended in its past. Evelyn rested her hand lightly against the veranda railing. For the first time since stepping into the auction room months ago, she felt no tension beneath her ribs, no uncertainty. The Ashcombe Mansion had been reclaimed, not through renovation alone, but through acknowledgement. And Rex, once alert and unyielding at unseen signals, now slept peacefully beneath open windows. The house stood the same, but everything about it had changed. Winter arrived quietly in Braddock Hollow. A thin layer of frost gathered along the veranda railing each morning, catching the early light like powdered glass. The Ashcombe Mansion, outlined against a pale sky, no longer looked abandoned. It looked inhabited, lived in, cared for, understood. Evelyn moved through the halls without hesitation now. The grand staircase creaked in familiar rhythm beneath her steps. The ballroom, once hollow and uncertain, held framed displays and neatly arranged seating for occasional school tours. The West Wing corridor no longer carried shadow as its defining trait. It carried context. Rex followed her with steady ease. He no longer stiffened at upstairs windows. He no longer stationed himself at doorways. He walked as a companion, not a sentinel. Evelyn paused at the entrance to Clara's restored study. The preserved room had changed very little since the day she first opened it. The desk remained in its original place. The journals rested inside climate-controlled sleeves. The architectural plans lay flattened and framed. She stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. The air felt still but welcoming, not tense, not heavy, just present. She moved to the desk and ran her fingertips lightly across the surface. The grain of the wood, who had once hidden behind dust, now caught the afternoon light in warm tones. Outside the study window, bare tree branches swayed against a clear sky. Rex entered and settled near her feet. For a long moment, Evelyn simply stood there. Months earlier, she had walked into a county auction room as a retired widow searching for something she could not quite name. She had placed a $100 bid on a structure everyone else had dismissed. She had not known what she was buying. Not really. She had thought it was a project, a distraction, perhaps even an act of stubborn defiance against the slow narrowing of her life. Instead, she had uncovered a voice. She pulled Clara's final journal entry from its protective sleeve and read the closing lines once more. "They have called me unstable. Father says it is for my own good." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Clara had written those words, knowing she would likely be silenced. She had sealed this corridor not to hide shame, but to protect truth until someone cared enough to open it. Rex shifted slightly, resting his chin on his paws. "You knew there was something here," Evelyn said softly to him. He blinked slowly, untroubled. He had followed scent and air currents, physical signals invisible to human perception. He had reacted to something no one else saw. And because she had trusted him, she had stepped forward instead of stepping away. Evelyn walked to the small window and opened it a few inches. Cold winter air drifted into the study, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant river water. The draft moved gently through the servant corridor beyond the wall, no longer trapped, no longer seeking escape. She leaned her palms against the windowsill and looked out across the lawn. The historical marker stood near the gravel drive, its bronze surface catching a narrow band of sunlight. Footprints in the frost marked where visitors had walked earlier in the day. The town had not transformed overnight. It still carried economic strain. It still bore scars from industry and decline. But something intangible had shifted. People spoke differently now when discussing the past. They asked questions. They examined records. They no longer accepted silence as default. Evelyn returned to the desk and placed Clara's journal carefully back into its sleeve. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel vindication. What she felt was quieter than that. Peace. Rex rose and walked toward her, brushing gently against her leg. "Ready?" she asked him. He wagged his tail once, measured, content. They left the study together, stepping into the West Wing corridor where soft lighting illuminated the once sealed plaster seam. A small placard beside it explained the discovery in simple language. Visitors paused there now, not in fear, but in reflection. Evelyn descended the grand staircase slowly. In the foyer, a small group of local students listened as a volunteer explained how documents could reshape history. Their voices carried upward in curious tones. Evelyn smiled faintly. She stepped outside onto the veranda. The sky was turning lavender as evening approached. She rested her hand along the railing, feeling the cold wood beneath her palm. The Ashcombe Mansion had not been valuable in the way investors measured worth, when it had not promised comfort. It had not promised ease. But within its walls had been something overlooked, something others had abandoned because it seemed inconvenient, complicated, or unsettling. She looked down at Rex, who sat beside her calmly, watching the quiet town below.
Sometimes she realized the things no one wants are the very things that carry the chill no one dared to face. And in choosing to protect what others abandon, we often rediscover parts of ourselves that were never truly lost. Evelyn exhaled slowly, feeling the steady warmth of winter air moving through the open windows behind her. The house no longer waited. It simply stood, reserved, understood, and at peace. The Ashcombe Mansion was never just a building. It was a voice wanted for someone brave enough to listen. Evelyn didn't set out to rewrite his story. She simply chose not to walk away when everyone else did. If you had stood in that awesome room and seen what she saw, would you have taken the risk or let it go? I'd love to hear your honest answer in the comments. And if stories like this remind you that it's never too late to uncover something meaningful, consider subscribing so we can keep exploring them together.